Okay, Assalamu alaikum everybody. Um, I'm replacing Grace for today. And we decided pretty much everything at Asuli for the last, since this has begun, has all been dedicated to Palestine. So for this week, instead of holding the regular halakas, we decided to hold another conversation with Jana al-Akhras and Shayan Parsai and my father. And I just, before we begin, want to encourage everybody to go listen to the khutbah that happened on Friday if you weren't able to. It was perhaps, I mean, we've been doing khutbahs for about 6 years, and I'm one of the people that's been able to listen to all of them and had that privilege. And it was perhaps one of the most amazing and comprehensive khutbahs that connected everything. Um, that has to do with Islam and everything that we've seen over the last 30 years, and really illustrates why Palestine is humanity's issue and everyone's issue. So, without further ado, I'll pass it off to my father. And good luck. We look forward to hearing what you all have to say.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الحمد لله وسبحان الله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وآله وأصحابه ومن اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم اشرح لنا صدورنا واحلل عقدة من ألسنتنا يفقهوا قولنا يا رب العالمين. Jenna has a presentation. We will address, inshallah, the events, what is going on in Gaza and in Palestine, using the presentation as an instrument to address the larger issues. So I'm gonna actually, Jenna can talk about the presentation and what we're going to do. So I'm just gonna give it to you.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Um, so this past June, I went to Palestine with my family, all of my siblings, my parents, my husband Cheyenne, my sister-in-law, and it was actually the first time that we were able to, as a family, visit Palestine, and that's something pretty significant in the life of a Palestinian who doesn't have a Hawiyah.
Translation.
Yeah, so a Hawiyah is a identification card, and there are different types of identification. I think we'll get into this, but it saves a little bit of time to preface it with the fact that different types of identification for people within one particular body is one of the telltale signs of apartheid. So if you were Palestinian living in an area designated as Historical Palestine 1948, you could either have Israeli citizenship, meaning making you Arab Israeli. There were a set number of Arabs who were living there who received Israeli citizenship. There were others who got a blue ID, and so therefore they're able to travel between what is modern day Israel and the West Bank. And then there are those who only have a green ID, a green Hawiyah, which allows you only to be within the West Bank, and you're not allowed to travel outside of that space at all. And so movement for Palestinians is very, very controlled. There are, the time that it takes traditionally or typically from Bethlehem, for example, to El Khalil is not any longer than a few kilometers, but it takes hours for people with just green IDs. And so, as a Palestinian American, somebody whose grandparents were forced out of Palestine in 1948, we don't have Palestinian identification. Our refugee status, in that way, is inherited. And refugee status is a pretty significant thing because, under UNRWA, the United Nations, refugees, anyone who is displaced from their land, their descendants are refugees. And so we don't have Palestine. That's all to say that going to Palestine as a family uh, was a very canon event, I think, for us. And during that time period, we were able to go to Al-Quds, Jerusalem. We were able to go to historic Palestine, so the north, Haifa, Yafa, Akka. We were able to go to Al-Khalil, which is still in the West Bank, Hebron. And I'm hoping that through the showing some of these photos as I've collected them, and I have videos at the end, will help you understand that what it means to live under apartheid, what Palestine's current state looks like, how people are living to a certain degree, and kind of just remind you that the idea of a land for a people, for a land for people with a people without a land, is a lie, and the land is witness and testimony to that. So.
Maybe in the meanwhile, I'll reflect as a non-Palestinian with the privilege of being able to join this trip. It was actually my second. We had gone previously, remind me of the date, in late February of 2020.
2020.
Just before COVID lockdowns really took shape. And so that first time we were in Jerusalem and we went to Khalil and Beit Lahem. And Khalil in particular was a very difficult, in the previous episode on this topic I spoke about it. Khalil was a very difficult place to really understand and wrap one's head around. Obviously in Jerusalem you can see the divisions, but you're also awestruck by the beauty and the grandioseness of old Jerusalem and the city and the liveliness of the people, and the wonder of Masjid al-Aqsa, and it's very overwhelming in that sense. You can't believe that you're somewhere that you've seen on television, like Bab al-Amud and these kinds of places where there's so many historic moments have taken place in the last 20, 30, 40 years. But Khalil was very different, and myself and my brother-in-law, being Jenna's brother, were walking through the old city, and I saw her continuously check back with kind of like a confused but worried face as she was explaining to us these different things, as she'd been several times before, about, if the shopkeepers leave, they will weld the doors shut, and the trash that's above your head, and the very violent settlers that live in that region, the dangers of which roads one can access and one cannot access, or else you will be shot or detained, regardless of who you are. It doesn't matter what kind of passport you carry. The heaviness in Khalil was very, very apparent, and that was very shocking, and it was very overwhelming. And there was a moment where Jenna kept having to ask and was a bit confused as to if something was wrong. And I think I finally came to my senses, and I think I tried to explain something that probably her brother couldn't explain at the moment, where it was very overwhelming. It was extremely, extremely overwhelming. And I felt that the first time that I was there, mostly I was just an observer, barely able to just soak in the data of the space that I was in for a 2 to 3 day period. There's only so much that a human being who lives in a substantial amount of privilege can process when submerged into a reality that is extremely evil and systematically so. Things that feel completely out of place, and your brain tries to register, how could this be happening here? And it wasn't until I was able to return this year that my brain had adjusted to that reality. So that first trip was mostly just about getting my bearings, trying to understand what was the space that I was entering, what did it feel like. And as being able to expect that reality, going back in a few years later, I was able to better understand and use the opportunity to take the time to make observations and look for particular things that beforehand I wouldn't. It was that the first trip was happening to me, but in the second trip I was an active participant in that reality, and I think that really made a difference, and it really galvanized my sense of purpose when I returned.
After the presentation, I have questions about the settlers because I think a lot of people don't realize that the apartheid regime is not just Israeli police or Israeli army, that the settlers are an active part of the dynamics of subordination. The settlers come from mostly from Western countries. The settlers are mostly white people. Many of them are Americans. They carry weapons, and they are any Palestinian, any Palestinian that is carrying a green card is always worried about making the wrong turn
Right.
and finding themselves. Uh, any settler can assault them, and in the long history, because there's a long history of settler violence, meaning not just assaults but death, killing Palestinians, no settler is held accountable. It's not like you kill a Palestinian and then you are tried for murder. You kill a Palestinian and it's okay. It's not a problem. You assault, you beat a Palestinian. Israel has never held a settler accountable for an assault or murder of a Palestinian. So when you're a Palestinian, your anxiety is endless, it's constant. And because one of the questions that is often repeated, well, why attack settlers? Because Palestinians have see settlers as a constant aggressor.
Right.
They don't see them neutrally.
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
The presentation is a bit lofty for what I've put together, so I hope y'all bear. I wanted to start with what the first thing you would typically see when you came into Jerusalem. This is the Damascus Gate. So these are the walls that surround the old city. I mean, these are Ottoman era walls, if I'm not mistaken, Sheikh.
The walls
Yeah.
are where some of them go back to the time of Salah ad-Din, and some of them even earlier. So they go back to medieval era.
Yeah.
They're quite old.
So yeah, so this would be the first thing that you see when you enter. And the thing to note about this area is that, again, anyone who lives in Al-Quds either has a blue ID or has a blue ID. So that's the blue ID. So at that point, you would be able to travel between the West Bank and Israel, but it's not. But again, I want to be clear because we are talking so heavily about Gaza. No one gets into Gaza, and that's kind of. I really wish I would have added a map onto this because it helps illustrate the absolute separation between the areas. But so when you're walking into the Damascus Gate, and then as soon as you're going in, obviously this is Qubbat al-Sakhra. I think something that I always hear confused among Muslimin is the difference between Masjid al-Aqsa and Qubbat al-Sakhra. And a lot of people post this photo talking about Masjid al-Aqsa and say it consistently. Obviously, the Dome of the Rock is where the Isra and Mi'raj took place. And Masjid al-Aqsa, the entire compound is Masjid al-Aqsa. Like this entire area is Masjid al-Aqsa. And so a lot of the times people don't pay attention to the actual Masjid al-Aqsa from the outside until it's being attacked during Ramadan. And are most notable and most known to direct their attention to the gold dome of the Dome of the rock. But I think it's important to note that there is a distinction at minimum, but the entire compound.
And when was that photo taken? This one.
So this photo was actually taken during Waqfat Arafah, so the day before Eid. So you can see everybody's like outside waiting for iftar, and we can go into that a little bit later. But I think the thing that's also important is that when we talk about Palestine, when we talk about going to masajid, and particularly Qubbat al-Sakhra and Masjid al-Aqsa, these people, every single time that they go to this masjid, it is an act of resistance. Every single time that you step onto this compound and you have to go through a checkpoint in order to go to your holy site, it's an act of resistance because they have the right to tell you that you're not allowed to enter that compound. You don't immediately enter from the old gates, the walls of the old city into Masjid al-Aqsa. There are still, when you're walking through the old city, if you've ever been to one of Middle Eastern countries, you can kind of understand what I mean. They're like narrow and there's shopkeepers and there's things on each side of you. And then you're walking towards a general centralized direction. And then once you get to that direction, there are guards. And those guards, international law and Israeli understanding would state that they are all Druze, which would make them supposedly neutral parties to be the people who decide who gets to enter that space. So the idea is that neither Muslim nor Jew can be the people who are standing guard at the doors as to who's supposed to enter. So the solution here has been to give that duty to the Druze of the Israeli army. But that doesn't necessarily make it any more neutral. So I hope.
Because they're part of the Israeli military establishment.
Yeah.
I mean, their commanders are Israelis. And also, when the settler trespasses upon the Aqsa Mosque happen, they happen with the protection of the actual Israeli army.
Yeah.
So, and the Druze police are simply ordered to step aside.
Right.
And it's important to note too that you're allowed to be questioned in any sort of regard. So I wear hijab, and so typically when I'm walking into that space, I look Arab enough, in order to be able to walk into these spaces. But for example, my dad is a taller man than a lot of people who walk around and stuff, and he has been stopped multiple times, asked, "Are you Muslim? Recite Surah Al-Fatiha, prove that you're Muslim." Like all of these types of things in order to be able to step into these spaces. And so it's really you and your luck that day, and whichever soldier that you get. And then obviously, anyone who doesn't have a blue ID, again, this is the part that people I don't think understand in terms of apartheid. If you don't have a blue ID, you cannot see Masjid al-Aqsa. You cannot go to Qubbat al-Sakhra. So there are plenty of Palestinians who have lived their entire lives in the West Bank with a green ID and have not been allowed to go through the checkpoints to see Masjid al-Aqsa or Qubbat al-Sakhra. They've lived their entire lives in this country and have not been able to go pray in their holy masjid. And there's something called tasrih, which is like a pass of some sort. I don't know what and you can get special permission, but that special permission is typically never given to Palestinian men under the age of 45, because any man who's Palestinian under the age of 45 is considered a threat. And so they'll give them to older men, or they'll give them sometimes on Fridays or sometimes on Eid, but it's really kind of a lottery system. So you can pretty much bank and guarantee that if you are Palestinian with a green ID living in Ramallah or in Bethlehem or any of the many pockets of areas of the West Bank, that you could have possibly never seen Jerusalem, and that you've never been to Qubbat al-Sakhra, you've never been to Masjid al-Aqsa. And that's really, really devastating, I think, for a lot of people, especially I think the reason that Palestinian Americans hold these moments so special, because we recognize that if without having a green ID and without having that limitation, because that's another part of the equation. I'm Palestinian, but I have an American citizenship. I was born and raised here. Had I been a Palestinian who was born and raised in America, but also had a green ID, as in if I would have been forced to have one of those, I wouldn't be able to enter Jerusalem either. So your Americanness doesn't override your Palestinian ID number. Your Americanness doesn't override your green ID. Your Americanness, it's indicated that that's the status that you have in Palestine. And so there are so many limitations on the access to the holy site, which is why, I mean, sometimes you'll hear people call for, acts of boycott. Like, you shouldn't go to Jerusalem, or you shouldn't go to Qubbat al-Sakhra, you shouldn't go to Masjid al-Aqsa, you shouldn't go to these places until Palestinians are allowed to go. And to that, maybe this is a little bit off topic, I firmly reject that. I firmly reject that as a premise. I think anybody who wants and can go to Masjid al-Aqsa and Qubbat al-Sakhra absolutely should. And that's something that I think Shayan can testify to. He's not Palestinian. But to me, the bigger tragedy, the bigger travesty would be to abandon this space. It's very hard to not fight tooth and nail for the recognition of Palestine, Masjid al-Aqsa, Qubbat al-Sakhra, for the freedom, for the liberation of Jerusalem, for the liberation of the Quds. It's hard to not do that once you've been there and once you've seen.
And furthermore, what is the testimony of the people in in the old city? These are the people who are, just mere steps away from Masjid al-Aqsa.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a firm believer that all people in the United States should actually firmly listen to what Palestinians in Palestine are saying. I think a lot of the times we get wrapped up in rhetoric in the United States, and we're separated from the actual language of the people who are speaking on the ground. And Palestinians in Palestine want non-Palestinians to visit.
I think that everyone that is active with regards to this movement means well, and I don't think anyone comes from a place other than good faith. It's just a testament to how difficult the circumstances are in the organizational process, and how separated we are. It's not just that Palestinians and Muslims are separated in the occupied territories, but even here in the United States, it feels that though we can communicate with one another, we are sent so many curveballs our way within our internal dialogue, and so many factions arise in a free and democratic space where we have the ability to have dialogue, and still yet there is this factionalism, and that's just really disappointing. But the overwhelming reception that I received on both times was, thank you for being here. Is there anything I can do for you? And they're speaking English, and a lot of them are, lived in the diaspora and then returned, and said, you're from Columbus. I went to school at the University of Michigan, et cetera, et cetera. Speaking, so it was amazing to be able to converse and speak to, families that have owned some of these shops in the old city for generations, and this insistence of not giving up, and offering this guidance of come back, because this keeps our claim alive, and those who are there are doing everything they can to show that we are not going to give this space up. But what would it feel like if all of that responsibility fell squarely on your shoulders as you're living in a brutal occupation your entire life? Having someone to come there and show and prove to that fascist government that the rest of the world hasn't forgotten about this space, despite the fact that international bodies and countries are normalizing and allowing for these infractions to take place in this space, that the average Muslim and the average individual will not stand for it, and they will continue to come there despite the pressure they might receive from their family in terms of being afraid for their safety or otherwise.
This is Bab al-Khalil, and it's said to be the gate at which Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab came and was given the keys to the city, to Jerusalem. And we all know the age-old people didn't recognize him as the Khalifa because he was walking on foot, and his slave was walking on horseback. But this is the entrance to this area. This is the view from inside Masjid al-Aqsa to
Masjid al-Qibli.
Yeah, so Masjid al-Qibli to Qubbat al-Sakhra. A lot of these don't have necessarily points to the I think they're important to see. I think it's important to know what this ard looks like from the inside. I think it's important to know what this space looks like when it's not in the throes um, of of aggression. I think a lot of the times we see these views of this masjid only in conflict, and we don't really have the ability to see what it could look like in potential when people are just there doing exactly what they want to be doing. And I think that's important to be able to see that.
If you can go back, that this, these large green doors, you may have seen them before. When if you have seen the videos of when the occupation soldiers attack Masjid al-Aqsa and the people inside Masjid al-Aqsa, and they're fighting, and you see that same red carpet, and they shut those large doors and they bolster them and they hide behind, and they take sanctuary essentially in Masjid al-Qibli. These are the doors that try at least to keep the soldiers out.
And this is inside Masjid al-Qibli. Just people in various stages of worship, various ages. Palestine attracts everybody. I think one of the most beautiful things I really ever heard was when I was in Palestine in 2020. We were walking by a street and it was called Shara Esfahan. So it was a street of Esfahan Street, and I remember, taking a photo of it, telling my husband he had to be next to it, being really excited. And then I talked to my dad about it, and he said very clearly that Palestine and Palestine, throughout the course of history, has always been a space of welcoming, has always been a place in which people, if they were on their way to like finishing their Hajj or finishing their Hijrah or doing whatever, would cross through Palestine and make that journey as well. And many people just never left. And it's always been a very, very welcoming space. And you can hear that. You can hear so many languages every time that I've gone. It doesn't really matter. There's not really an off season for tourism or whatever you want to call it. But there's always people from so many different backgrounds. And I think that's part of the marvel of Palestine. And that's actually the marvel of Palestinians who live in Palestine. It's an unbelievably welcoming community, and it always has been. The next few photos are photos of where the attacks on the masjid, the stained glass windows. There's thousands. It's just this is history that really can't be replicated. What did I put here? Is this the Taqiqana? Is this the Turkey?
This is in Khalil.
Oh, okay. So yeah, this is.
Can you explain the point about this stained glass? Because don't assume people know.
Yeah, sorry. The attacks on Masjid al-Aqsa that happen pretty consistently, but always ramp up during Ramadan. And people who choose to be in the masjid and defend that masjid, aside from just with their bodies, the masjid itself takes damage. And just this past Ramadan, we saw videos of soldiers coming into the masjid, shooting people with live rounds, with rubber bullets and live rounds, tear gas canisters. We have a concept in American law of sanctuary, of being in a place in which you can't be arrested, and being in a space in which you can claim sanctuary. And the masjid itself and its people are under attack, and these photos are just what's left of the attacks after they've gone. And that's kind of what I mean by the buildings, the structures, everything bears testimony to the violence that is inflicted upon it. You can't escape it. Again, even in moments of relative calm, because that's what I would say our past trip in June was. It was a moment of relative calm. You can't really escape the awareness that you are constantly under an occupying force, and even your places of sanctuary are bearing witness to that.
And I want to add that this damage is not accidental damage that's taking place. This is by the door, so it seems to illustrate, they were shooting gas canisters and it may have done damage. But if you go to the previous slide here in Masjid al-Qibli, when you're looking at it from the hall, the previous slide, if you look at the top all the way in the back, there are 3 windows. Those are stained glass. And then if you continue on the sides, you can see these windows above the arches. And those windows are also extremely beautiful stained glass windows. So then explain to me, how is it that I've documented, and I don't know if it's in this slideshow, and perhaps maybe even we can compile these and put them somewhere so that we can all review them on a website somewhere. But there was 5, 6, 7, or 8 of those stained glass windows that were shattered, and I could see, and I recorded the damage. In fact, there was a time that I went and I recorded the damage as much as I could, trying to find like every nook and cranny of Masjid al-Qibli to see where did they do this. This was not accidental. It's clear. You don't need to be like a special detective to put that together. This is like 15 feet in the air, 20 feet in the air, the ceiling.
It's well documented that the settlers intentionally just attacked and destroyed the stained glass, and the stained glass is hundreds of years old and irreplaceable. And so, I mean, this because the settlers believe that the Aqsa Mosque shouldn't be there. I mean, they want to destroy. So, and there's again part of the whole problem is that Israeli soldiers, all they do is prevent Palestinians from stopping settler aggression. So they're there basically to protect the settlers, and they do very little to restrain the settlers themselves. They pretty much just attack Palestinians, or they inflict violence on Palestinians. But that is part of the trauma that we keep dealing with over and over and over.
Yeah, and they're not supposed to. The settlers aren't supposed to be on the mosque grounds at all. They're not supposed to be in the surrounding area. They're not supposed to be in the space. But they've more often than not recently been coming under IDF protection in large groups to incite violence
on a near daily basis
in that space. And I remember very distinctly when it was the biggest, headline news that Ariel Sharon had gone to the Temple Mount, like that moment in time in which it was an act of defiance on behalf of Ariel Sharon to come to this space and in defiance in front of the entire world to show that these laws don't apply to me. And he's not wrong, because it's now gotten to the point where we are in 2023, and it's not an uncommon sight to just see swaths of settlers come through this space to antagonize worshipers. It's just every action is intended to intimidate, to belittle, to humiliate, and to shame. These are, the sesame breads of Al-Quds. They're
very famous.
Yeah, they're very famous. They're very well known. There's the falafel on the side, and even the falafel is stuffed with sumac and onions, and everyone has these for breakfast. This is one of the ceilings of Masjid al-Qibli. Every ceiling that you walk, like if you saw the earlier photo and it looked just like one long ways, all of the ceilings are different. So just unbelievably beautifully made and maintained. This window, again, you'll see people at all times of day reading Quran at the masjid and just, staying in that space. But this window actually overlooks the western wall. And so once you get closer to that window, you can see, people who are worshiping at the western wall, but you can also hear at times of prayer where they'll blast music that's meant to disrupt prayer. And again, because these windows are open, that's what you're happening. But that's another bit of destruction on the masjid.
And it's just heartbreaking,
Part of the settler attacks.
Yeah. And this is Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi's mimbar. And there's 3 of them. And this one, I believe, was one of the ones that was set on fire. And the interesting thing about this mimbar actually is that there's not a single nail. They're just pieces. And it's like, I don't know what the method of actually putting that together is, but there's not a single nail, there's not a single screw. It's just all the pieces that are holding themselves together. So it's the front of the mimbar. Another thing that I'll say in general, and maybe this is off topic, but one thing that I really personally love about these masajid in these spaces is that they weren't built with men or women specifically in mind. And that's maybe just an aside. But if you can see where I'm particularly seated, I'm at the front of the masjid. I'm next to the minbar. I'm where the imam would have been occupying that space for salah. Our masajid are for everybody. And I think that's one of my favorite things about being in Palestine, that it's a reminder of that. I don't have to concern myself with a men's or a women's entrance when I'm going into my mosque. And maybe that's an aside, but maybe it's something to chew on. So this would be your view walking away from the Dome of the Rock into Masjid al-Qibli. And, you know, the domes of Masjid al-Aqsa are green. And greenish, but, yeah, so that would be on the way there. And that's the Dome of the Rock. So these are just, imagine me turned around. That's what you're seeing from one way to the other. And this is where a lot of the, again, I don't like to use the language of the occupier. So clashes, war, conflict, like these aren't words that I personally like to use, but these are the sites of all the things that you're seeing on TV and where they're happening. I mean, look at the magnitude of the space around you. It is heartbreaking is one thing, but it's also impossible sometimes in the mind of somebody who understands the sanctity of these spaces to imagine how little respect that the occupying force has for these spaces, for this history that has outlasted us and them and will outlast us and will outlast them, and the complete disregard for the space and for its history and for its people and for the people who you know, put their bodies on the line to protect it. This is the view of Qubbat al-Sakhra from the top of, this is from the other side of the old city, but it's also the same view that you get from where Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi's home was. So again, a lot of history in this space. Now, the reason I actually included this one, it's the true historical timeline of Jerusalem. So
where is this? Can you remind?
This is in the this is in West Jerusalem. So
explain about
yeah, so Jerusalem is, you know, there's East Jerusalem and there's West Jerusalem, and like where there's also different quarters. There's Christian quarters, there's Muslim quarters of Jerusalem, there's Jewish quarters of Jerusalem, but on the in the Jewish quarters of Jerusalem, in West Jerusalem, there's a lot of active propaganda, like a lot of active propaganda, and I've tried to document some of that. But again, I want something to, if nothing else sticks with you after this talk, I think the thing that's most important is that if you are trying to colonize a people in a land that have such a rich history, you have to work overtime to do it. And part of working overtime to do it includes these types of timelines that are plastered all over the place. These timelines are plastered all over the place. There are things that you can't carve out of the walls, right? You can hurt the structure of the space that you're trying to claim was yours and that you never kicked anyone out to get, and all of these types of things. But there are certain things you can't hide, and where you can't hide them, we have poster board, apparently. So just something worth noting. The next few things I wanted to show and are particularly dear to me is I'm from Hebron. My dad's side of the family is from a suburb of Al-Khalil called Deir al-Dibban, which was completely wiped off of the map in 1948. And this is the outside of Masjid al-Ibrahimi. This is the Abrahamic mosque in Al-Khalil. Now, most people don't see this view, and the reason you don't see this view is because Muslims aren't allowed on this side of the masjid. Now, it's a massive masjid. It's very, very big. And this is, if you're seeing, this is the entrance, this is the side that you would see as a Muslim. And one of those on the top, on the right corner of the screen is a watchtower. And so you'll have IDF soldiers who are positioned in that space. And then, you know, obviously, I didn't take photos of the checkpoints as I was crossing through them because you're not allowed to have your phones out. But you would have walked through a checkpoint in order to only then come and see a very intimidating watchtower and Israeli soldiers armed behind it as you're entering the mosque. Now, this is the side, again, that most people don't see. I take a lot of photos in these spaces to make it clear that, like, these are ours as well, and we just don't happen to see them. Now, the thing that's interesting about, or heartbreaking more than interesting about Masjid al-Ibrahimi, is that the reason it was divided, and we spoke about this a little bit last time, and I'll actually just read it very specifically because I don't want to mistake this one at all. The Ibrahimi Mosque massacre was a shooting carried out by Baruch Goldenstein, an American-Israeli extremist and member of the far-right Koch movement, on the 25th of February 1994, during the Jewish holiday of Purim, which had overlapped in that year with the Islamic holy month of Ramadan. Goldstein opened fire on a large number of Palestinian Muslims who had gathered inside to pray. The attack left 29 people dead, several as young as 12 years old, and 125 wounded, in prayer. As a result, the mosque was divided between Muslims and Jews of the area, with Muslims getting 35% of the original masjid. So this entryway is the entryway that they have been afforded. Now, to the left of me, which is a little bit off screen, is a tunnel, like a almost like a sky tower, and then an elevator. And the elevator takes you directly from the settlements up and then cross, so you will never have to cross into a Palestinian. You'll never have to cross a Palestinian in order to get into the masjid. Because again, Khalid is a very, very aggressive space that the settlers occupy. And they, as little interaction with Muslims as possible is something that they strive for, unless they're terrorizing. So that's the entry in that way.
This is a mosque that used to be 100% Muslim, and they took 70% of it after a massacre. It's mind blowing. After a massacre by a Jewish extremist.
And that's Sayyidina Yusuf's grave. So this masjid is particularly of importance because it has Sayyidina Ibrahim, Yusuf, Yaqub, Sayyidina Maryam, Sayyidina Rifqa, who I believe was Sayyidina Yaqub's wife, and Sayyidina Ismail, and Sayyidina Sarah. So there's quite a few people buried in this space. And this is Sayyidina Ibrahim's tomb. Now the reason I included this photo is if you can see to the left of the tomb, there's bulletproof glass. And that bulletproof glass shows behind it another window. And then that window is where the Jewish side of the masjid is now. It's hard to say it out loud, the Jewish side of the masjid. But yeah, that's the entryway. And so they ensure that there is bulletproof glass in that space because of how aggressive the settlers in Al-Khalil are.
These are, of course, these are the maqams of the purported gravesite, and the gravesite is actually under the structure. And I think in the next slide here, you can talk about that.
So I was talking to, one of the stewards of this masjid, and, Allah ya'tihim as-sihha saraha, because they do such tireless work, but he was showing me where the stairs used to be to where they would be able to go down to the actual graves. And then they had sealed them off to ensure that the graves weren't desecrated, because that was going to be next after the taking of the 35% of the masjid was left to Muslimin, but they wanted to ensure that no one could ever harm the grave sites, and so they just completely sealed off that area. But this entire area, the entire masalla, the entire area for prayer is the exact same size on the bottom. So you can imagine there's like an entire another prayer area the same size as the mosque above it that's been sealed off. And that's the minbar. That's the entrance. I think there's, towards the end, I'm going to show you guys. Actually, I have an entire video of the whole masjid because the day that we went was Eid, and there's only 10 days of the year in which Muslims have access to the entire mosque, and Eid is one of those days. I think the Mawlid is another. There are a few here. Isra al-Mi'raj, I believe, is a day. But overall, there's only 10 days of the year in which Muslims get unfettered access to the entire mosque. And so you'll be able to see that video towards the end. But the reason I brought this up here is that you see the minbar kind of off to the right. That's the other minbar of Salah ad-Din. And then this is the entrance that you would go to in order to get into the masjid. Now, Al Khalil is a particularly heartbreaking space because of the active effort in order to remove the Palestinian population. When we talk about apartheid and we talk about colonization, it's not a passive event. It's not that life just gets hard somehow and people decide to immigrate to the United States. It's not, the result of Palestinian migration to the United States for the most part is not just as a result of like, oh, the Palestinian economy is really tough and we're just looking for a better life in the American dream. No, it's an active effort to remove Palestinians from that space. And Hebron is actually one of the best examples of that. And it's a fascinating case study, for lack of a better word, because it's still in the throes of that removal. There's other spaces, and we'll talk about them in northern Palestine, in Haifa and Akka and Yafa, where the Palestinian population back in 48 was just so disseminated to the point that they are just a true minority at this point. But Al-Khalil is a space in which there's still a push and pull as to who the minority is going to be or the majority is going to be in Al-Khalil. And I think I said this last time that the way that H1 and H2 are zoned out, it's that the entire outskirt of Al-Khalil, which used to be fully Palestinian, only now has 50 Palestinian families in it. And the Palestinian families that are left have been pushed into the center of the city. So they're fully surrounded. And they're fully surrounded in this way that means that, they don't, the roads that cut into these older cities, they're cut off. The certain roads you can't walk on, certain roads you can't drive on, certain roads you're not even allowed to have shops on. And so Shara' al-Shuhada, which is one of the roads that used to be a gold street, was one of the roads that I found myself on in 2012 on accident. I was there with a group of other Palestinian Americans. Some had Hawiyah, some didn't have anything at all. And we were walking around Hebron, and all of a sudden, like we're in the old city, and all of a sudden we just took a wrong turn, and we saw some kids coming back from school, some settler children come back from school, like sprint past us, run towards a watchtower, and then all of a sudden, an IDF soldier comes down from the watchtower, calls other people, and we were surrounded all of a sudden because we ended up on the wrong road. And
with weapons.
Yeah, surrounded with weapons pointed at us, and we're screaming like, we're Americans, like, here's my passport, here's my whatever. But that's kind of a dangerous thing to do in that space too, because for some of the people that we have, even if they were American, they had a green Hawiyah. They weren't supposed to be in that space. Or some of them, the idea that having the wrong ID on you or not having the right ID is enough to qualify for an extrajudicial action is one that I think kind of breaks your brain to a particular way, because I'm an attorney and I live in the United States, and I'm the person that people call when they need their rights defended in a lot of ways. And so you hear often like, where's the attorney? Does anyone know an attorney? Whatever, like, don't talk to the cops unless you have an attorney. And then I'm in this space and I am the American who's sillily, showing her passport to say, like, I'm an American, you can't hurt me. Well, you're Palestinian before you're American in Palestine. And I think that's, Al-Khalil is the most obvious space to see that. So yeah, eventually we found ourselves, we had someone with us who spoke, he was from Jerusalem actually, and he spoke Hebrew pretty well, so he was able to de-escalate the situation. But Al-Khalil is a scary space to the point that it's a scary space because of the settlers who are armed to the teeth. Just this past week, the Israeli Defense Ministry said that they were going to arm 4,000 settlers across the West Bank in response to what's happening in Gaza, that they were going to arm 4,000 settlers with weapons in the West Bank. And as of this week, I believe over 55 Palestinians in the West Bank have died. Over 55 Palestinians in the West Bank have died. And so... killed, yes, you're right. Sorry.
Yeah, they were killed. Yeah. They didn't just die.
Yeah. And so, when we talk about Gaza, we can't separate Gaza from the larger conversation of the Israeli project. And the Israeli project is not going to be completed until Palestinians are definitively, if not wiped out, they are definitively the minority in this space. And Al-Khalil is a testament to the struggle of resistance and what that looks like. I encourage you to not just read up about Masjid Ibrahimi, but look at how the settlers treat Palestinians in Hebron. Look at how they ensure that their houses are built on top of their Palestinian houses and that they throw trash into the general walkways. Look at how they poison their water supplies. I mean, the first time that I went into Al Khalil, there was a Palestinian activist who we all knew very, very well, and they knew him very well because he was an activist. And his wife had had 3 miscarriages as a result of the attacks on their homes and the poisoning of their water supplies. Now, if you've ever been overseas, you know that water doesn't operate the same way we have it here. People have like gallons. They have tanks of water that come and they get filled up, and so the settlers would poison their water supply. So yeah, that is.
I think there's also an overwhelming conclusion that one takes from the observations that you're mentioning, and you're seeing it in real time. The hopes for an aspirational two-state solution seem ridiculous when you're in a space in a city like Khalil. They just seem like absolute impossibilities, especially given for the wanton disregard for Palestinian lives in every facet.
But the reason every year it becomes a bigger impossibility is because of the demographic changes that the Israeli settler project has worked. I mean, Oslo didn't stop them. Any treaty signed with Palestinians didn't stop them. They've changed the facts on the ground.
Precisely.
And continue to change the facts on the ground. And the Gazans, as well as the Palestinians in the West Bank, as well as the entire world, know that. I mean, it's not a secret. Mm-hmm. And what happened in the Ibrahimi Mosque, best case scenario is that it would be repeated in the Aqsa Mosque, right, according to them. Worst case is that Al-Aqsa Mosque would be completely destroyed and the temple rebuilt. So when you are talking to the most moderate Israelis, it's not that they're saying we will respect the borders of 67 or respect what was agreed on in Oslo Accords or respect what we agreed on with the Jordanian authorities. They're saying we're going to take over a minimum half of the Aqsa Mosque.
Correct.
And that. I mean, the West goes out of its way to say, let's not recognize this reality at all. Let's not recognize the fact that Palestinians have been systematically erased even after they signed the Oslo Accords.
Precisely correct.
So, like I said, my family's from Al Khalil in this village called Deir al-Dibban. They're the outskirts of Hebron, but in 1948, the entire village was demolished and its residents were expelled. So my family has 300 acres in this area, and that back structure is where the Khalil is actually known for its grapes. And so that structure in the back used to house the grape molasses, if you, like in that area. But we have the deed to this land, and we're not allowed to own it, build it, or do anything with it. And the reason for that is that Israel has a policy of people who they deem to have abandoned the space after having been forcibly exiled. So despite forcible exile, so, Palestinians who were kicked out in 1948, or if they were gone during that time period, for any reason during that time period, it doesn't matter what claim that you have to the land, they consider it abandoned, but they also aren't able to build on it. So we can't build on it, they can't build on it, but there's nothing that we can necessarily do to claim it. And that's what that land is. So 300 acres of land. The other side of my family is from Ain Karim, which is in Jerusalem. This used to be a masjid and has now been redesignated to again, like I said, that you have to rewrite history with poster board. So I'm pretty sure the one in front of this one says something about a Mary's Spring, which has no historical significance in this space at all, but it used to be a masjid. And this is the carvings that are above my grandfather's, the entryway to my grandfather's home. So I told the story in the last Palestine talk, and I can briefly tell it again. When my family was expelled in 1948 from Jerusalem, my Jidda was about 12 years old, and they were forced to go to Jordan, and they left as a result of the Nakba, where 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly expelled due to the creation of the State of Israel. And my great-grandfather was a builder, so he built this house. He fully built this house and had carved into the inscription, into the entryway, the opening of Surah Al-Fath is right in that way. So these were the original iron doors of that home. They're still, everything is still the same. This was my great uncle's home. So it was a lot of families would have compounds, or like, I don't know how to call it exactly, but so it would be, the patriarch of the home, and then the additional home, and then everyone would live in these spaces. And so that home was also for Dar Farhan. And that is, I think it's Al-Wahid Al-Qahar, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Al-Wahid Al-Qahar, and that's the inside of the home.
And you notice the original carvings from the Quran, and then you notice the Israeli the Jewish candles placed on top of the original site.
Yeah.
The menorah, yeah.
It really says a lot, that picture, I think.
Yeah.
They are just dropping their identity directly on top of it and not caring to even really cover what was there before. It was very interesting.
It's like, okay, well, this used to be native site, now it's ours, and deal with it.
So yeah, that's my grandfather's home, and this was the first time we were able to enter it. And upon entry, speaking to, that's another thing that you never really get used to, speaking to people who are in that space and they have an American accent too. See, I have an American accent because I was born here. They have American accents because they were born here too. And the woman who's living in this home right now has been renting it for 3 years and came from Boston. And so she's currently renting it from the Moroccan Jews who took it over after my family was kicked out. This is just a little bit more of generalized Islamic history in that space. This is the Islamic Supreme Committee. This is something that Shayan actually took a photo of. And it was, again, just attempts to, if you see behind it, that's a masjid.
So this is in the Jewish quarters of Jerusalem, in the Old City. And to the right of this photo, there is a very large dome, and it looks like a mosque, a historic mosque. And I kept looking at it strange and thinking, what is this structure? And it's written that this is a synagogue, etc., and it's an ancient synagogue, and it's very old, and all of this type of thing.
Entire fabricated history.
And so I walked over to the gates to see, can I enter and look inside? And you could see there's gates in front, and then there's this large, weird metal, what would you call that, obstruction that they've placed. And immediately behind it, you recognize there's Arabic. And it says, this is the mosque of Umar ibn al-Khattab. And I thought, it almost feels like they are mocking you. They didn't bother to take down this ancient inscription on the door. They've just put this ugly obstruction in front of it, and know that no one there really cares to look closer. And this is what we kept saying this, that the old city tells its tales, and somehow, some way, I don't know why, the Israelis that live there are somehow unable to contain, I don't know what I cannot explain it. They are somehow unable to contain the story that the city tells. And it surprises me, because what is so difficult about taking down that, this door, that it has this inscription?
This is, I mean, just to be very clear, this is a violation of international law, in violation of morality and ethics. This is Masjid Umar ibn Khattab that has been annexed, turned into a synagogue, and the official history posted by Israel ignores the fact that it was a
It's
mosque.
not even on. There is a timeline, and you referred to that time. It shows a timeline. That timeline is completely missing
Devoid of the Muslim
devoid of the
element.
part that you're looking at. You are seeing this with your own two eyes. That part of the timeline is missing.
It's like being gaslit in real time. It's another thing that's I think interesting to note is that the signs in Jerusalem will point you to certain directions. But the reason I brought this one on top is because you see there's Hebrew, Arabic, and English, and one of the methods of erasing the Palestinian identity is renaming streets and then writing the renamed streets in Arabic. And so, for example, you don't see signs that say Al Quds in Palestine. You see signs that say Arushalayim in Arabic. So Erushalayim is how you would say Jerusalem in Hebrew, but it's written in Arabic, like Alif, Ra, Aru, like Wow, Sha, like Erushalayim is how it's written, not Al Quds. So there are traditional Arabic names to cities, to streets, to areas, and they are completely wiped out and then rewritten in Arabic as though that is their original name.
If you could you go back? And there's a very interesting. I mean, here I can't see quite if you can read. And it's been someone scratched it out. But so on the walls there are signs that will point you in the old city towards different directions. So for instance, in the Jewish quarters, everyone is trying to go see the Western Wall, the Morak Wall, as we call it, the Western Wall, where the Wailing Wall is. And so it'll point you in a direction. The old city is obviously quite a difficult place to navigate if you're not really from there, and you rely on these signs to get around. And so we did go to the outside of the Western Wall and observed. And then when we were leaving, we tried to find our way back to Masjid al-Aqsa, which of course would be labeled as the Temple Mount. And we would come out, and I would look at this sort of sign, and I would look, and it says Western Wall this way and Temple Mount this way, and I'm thinking, okay, that will just take me right back to the Western Wall. Well, how does that make sense? I'm looking for the doors that will open to Masjid al-Aqsa. So how could that be? So I asked the shopkeeper, well, which way is Masjid al-Aqsa? And he says the complete opposite direction. And I say, well, but the sign says it's going this way. He said they make the signs lie because they want you to go to the Western Wall and they do not want you to go towards the Temple Mount. The signs are lying, which is very apt because that is the way that this occupation has been doing things for a very long time. People are today you are receiving reports and you just assume because it is a nation state or because this is the United States of America, the spokesman for the White House says something, you assume that, well, the position is so high and so authoritative, there's no way that they would tell a lie. But the whole place is based on a lie, including the signs. And that just really sat home with me about they don't care about playing fair at all.
This is the seal on the mosque in Jaffa. It's called Masjid al-Kabir, is what everyone calls it. So it's just the big mosque in Jaffa. And I think that's actually interesting because it has a name, right? The masjid is called Muhammadiyya Mosque. It's a Ottoman mosque. But the thing that's interesting about calling it the Great Mosque, the Big Mosque, and whatever, is that Jaffa used to have a lot of masajid, but this one is left as it's in a very touristy area now because of Jaffa's history. So Jaffa used to have about 120,000 Arabs living in it before the Nakba. And then after the Nakba, only 3,000 were left. Only 3,000 were left after 1948 of an initial population of 120,000 people. Now the numbers now have reached 20,000 people, but it's still a very, very persecuted minority. This is the masjid in which there is no parking lot. You will get ticketed if you try to go to this masjid. we were talking to the stewards of the masjid, and they were saying that on a good day, like even for Maghrib or even for large, salahs where you would expect the rooms or the masalla to be filled, they at most have 2 or 3 rows.
At most,
At
two.
most have 2 or 3 rows. And because anyone who goes to the masjid or is considered to be a masjid going Muslim or Palestinian in these spaces starts getting targeted by the IDF. And so, on top of being targeted, they have nowhere to park. They have nowhere to be able to operate in these spaces. But this masjid was actually finished in 1812. So again, there were people in Palestine, and they were building. This is the inside of the masjid.
Look how gorgeous it is.
It was
Beautiful.
one of the most beautiful mosques that that's saying a lot when you're in historic Palestine, but it was unbelievable. And it had a double dome, and it was a gorgeous double dome. And there was a section that it wasn't quite clear. It seemed to indicate, my father-in-law and I thought, maybe this masjid is in such great condition. Maybe that the Turkish government was the one that was looking after or financing, taking care of this mosque. And so we assumed that might be the case. And we spoke to the imam and said, this masjid is in such fantastic shape and repair. Is that because of the support from the Turkish government? And he said, we do not have any support from any government here. This is completely ran by 2 to 3 people that are taking care of this historic mosque. And look at the state of it.
And so then while we were in the north, we found ourselves obviously in Israeli majority areas. And one of the harrowing things that you'll see on Israeli roads is this man. And that's Theodor Herzl, the father of Zionism as we know it. And again, I think it says something to the intimidation factor. It's a weird, it looks like kind of a 3D printed figure. So at any point at which you see it from a distance, he looks like he's gazing at you in this very bizarre Mona Lisa-esque way. Can't lose the eye line, no matter at what point you're standing. And it's, anyone who tries to tell you that Zionism is a neutral process or a neutral ideology, and one that isn't a systematically violent understanding of colonialism and white supremacy is lying. But you don't have to really take my word for it. You just have to do the reading. Read what Theodor Herzl said about the formation of the state of Palestine. And he's heralded as a hero in these spaces. And I don't think you can get much more than that. This is a masjid that we saw in Akka. Haifa or Akka?
This is a masjid in Akka.
Akka. And this was a masjid that actually wasn't allowed to give the adhan, to call out the adhan. It was a fully occupied masjid. And in the past few years...
No, this is Haifa. This is the one that was...
Next to the Bahr.
Yes, this is a masjid in Haifa.
Yeah, masjid in Haifa. And so it was completely occupied, and we were at a restaurant actually, and again, it clearly was to the fact that the local population wasn't necessarily used to the fact that the masjid, the imam was allowed to call out the adhan because the masjid had been completely shut down. And they took the masjid back, and the adhan now is called out of that masjid. And again, Islam in these spaces, the adhan, salah, as an act of defiance in these spaces is the only place I've ever felt it really feel like an act of defiance. And it's powerful. Obviously, again, not a lot of photos on this trip of IDF soldiers, but figured we would throw one of those in here. This is in the Old City. And this is second day of Eid.
This is the Western Wall.
The Western Wall.
The Wailing Wall. There's a full party going on to the right of us, and it was blasting and blaring. And after this, when we went to the Masjid al-Aqsa compound,
you can hear it.
It was like it was blaring in your face. You couldn't. It didn't feel like you were at the mosque. It felt like you were at a strange party.
But it also says something to the idea of what people think coexistence looks like. You know, like we say this idea of like living side by side. You live side by side with the people who aren't antagonizing every waking moment of your being, and particularly on Eid. Um, and this, we're now kind of in the video portion of the thing. This is inside the Dome of the Rock. I just wanted to make sure there were some visuals. Um,
منزل السيد إسماعيل الشوا.
Yeah. So the houses in the old city traditionally would have. I mean, I guess this is as close you would get to a like
An address.
a mailbox notification. I'm not entirely sure, but these have all been taken, but they haven't taken those things off, which is very, again, it's interesting. I'm not. But yeah, these are the streets. So when I say the old city streets and how they look in that way, in Al Khalil, imagine that about midway through where you see those platforms, the Israelis have taken, or the settlers have taken the homes above the Palestinians, and then Palestinians have had to build cages above themselves. And so you're essentially you're fully trapped in, and it's just hailstorms of garbage above you. This is walking through Al Ibrahimi Mosque. Now, I'm like looking around very specifically because I've never been to this part of it. I've never seen this side of it.
This is the Jewish occupied side.
And this is the Jewish occupied side. And he was telling me at this point that a lot of their practices include writing prayers on pieces of paper and then throwing them into these spaces. But the keys to these gates are controlled by the Muslims. So they have to go in and clean it specifically. This is the land of my grandfather.
This is
in Deir al-Dibban in Khalil. That is where they would store the grapes. And then this is back in Masjid Ibrahimi. So this is what you would see when you're walking in. This is the side you would always have access to. And then I'll show you when that adjusts.
This is the main mosque prayer area. The minbar is towards the front.
And it's worth noting, and I mean, I think I'll get there when the camera pans over, that the area for making adhan is on the Israeli side. And so in order to make the adhan, the imam has to ask permission to do so. And I believe it was last Ramadan, the adhan could not be heard 23 out of the 30 days because he didn't have permission to give the adhan. And it's a total ban on adhan on Fridays and Saturdays because they cite it as a noise disturbance. And this is Sayyidina Ishaq's. And it's that wall to the left.
This is the maqam of
Sayyidina Ibrahim.
Yes. And just on the other side, towards the left.
And that's it. That's all the Muslims get. This door is constantly closed.
This is the door that the children would be on the other side, slapping and banging and trying to disturb people.
So the rest of the mosque, as you see it, for the rest of this walking tour, is not accessible to Muslimin 355 days of the year.
So this is all part of the Jewish part.
Yes.
Correct.
Yeah.
You can see how old the structure is.
So we don't really even have access to Sayyidina Yusuf. So this is where the door for the adhan is. It's on their side. He needs armed guards in order to make the adhan. This is the entrance that they have from the earlier photos that I showed you, and then this is where all the
Keep their books and
books and
small
Torahs and
library.
scrolls.
Yeah, and they of course changed the very shape of the mosque, or the very
Precisely.
furniture and.
I think we've already done that. This is Akka. This is in North Palestine. This is where Napoleon was unable to conquer. And then that's the. This is back in.
Masjid Ibrahimi again.
No, it's not.
Right?
This is,
What is this?
Ain Karim. This is the masjid that was turned into a fake
This is
church.
Ain Karim in Jerusalem.
It's a masjid that was turned into what?
It's not even a church. They've completely sealed it off.
I mean, they've sealed it
called
off.
a
They
church.
blocked it off with concrete and.
And then this is the view from my grandfather's home in Jerusalem. This is from the roof. This is him explaining.
This is where the grave site of
Was sealed off. The
Was
steps
sealed
to the
off,
sealed off. This is back inside Masjid al-Qibli.
These are the windows that I was
Al-Aqsa.
speaking about
The
earlier.
windows that were
The windows that you
that
can
were
see how
damaged,
they're damaged.
yeah.
See, that one has completely been removed. Some of them are
Yeah,
completely
damaged.
almost
The windows
smashed,
destroyed completely.
completely destroyed. 8, 9 of 10 of them. You can see more damage on this side, more damage, more, close to 50% or more are irreparably damaged.
As much as half of the windows are damaged.
Yep.
And this is all settlers' violence. I mean, this is all.
I mean, it's a stunning mosque. It is.
And if Palestinians try to interfere to stop the attack on the Aqsa, we've all seen the films of Palestinians being beaten and dragged and.
I don't think so. I mean, it probably will show the other. Yeah, that's it. This is the old city side.
This is just.
I'm trying to recall where this is.
Where are you here?
I think we were on the roads through. Oh, this was on our way to the north. Yeah. Again, so the apartheid wall is something that you'll see more of in the West Bank, and you see less of when you're in the central parts of 1948 or modern day Israel. And it's because the wall is so viciously domineering and separatist that, there are places in Bethlehem where people's backyards, their back door literally opens to the wall. And that type of impediment of travel, they reserve exclusively for Palestinians. And so because of the nature of the trip that we took this time, we didn't see much of the wall because we were on Israel only roads for the most part. And then this is just walking up.
It's Masjid al-Aqsa compound. I mean, the compound is a stunning place, and I've never been to Mecca, but from what I see in Mecca, um, nothing looks. It feels overwhelmingly new. It feels like there's just restaurants and coffee spots, and just from the pictures and videos I've seen. But when you're in the old city, there's some feeling that is kind of near indescribable, and you can't help but imagine what a free, liberated Jerusalem would look like under an ethical governance where ancient Palestine is preserved, and the feeling of the spiritual metaphysical reality that you're experiencing in that space is unfettered and unsullied by modern capitalism.
This pretty much concludes what I wanted to share with you guys. The last thing I wanted to show you was the takbirat of Eid, because I personally think they're very beautiful.
In the corridors or the streets of the old
Of the
city.
old city. And again, like I said, anytime somebody is outwardly Arab, Muslim, or Palestinian in Palestine, it's truly an act of resistance in the face of occupation because of heavy IDF and settler presence in all spaces. So when people are doing things like this, when they're protesting or even just being loud or doing takbirat al-Eid, these types of things don't come at no cost. You know, there's always a possibility of something being too much a reminder that there's an indigenous population there, which is why moments like this are so important to me and so powerful. And that's all. That's all I have for you guys.
And before we go on with this conversation, now maybe this gives a sense of what.
I don't know.
Oh, Maghrib. How much time do we have? Okay. We
20 minutes.
we need to stop for Maghrib because otherwise we'll miss it. So let's stop for Maghrib and then come back.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. We're going to get started again. And before we do, we have a guest performance by Wietske, the champion of the Dutch, who's going to perform for us a poem. And then after that, I think Sheikh is he wanted to share something, and we're going to go straight into Q&A after that. So start to send your questions in the chat, please, so we can go through them and get organized.
Okay, assalamu alaikum everyone. This will be very brief, but listening to Cheyenne and Jannah and Sheikh talk just now, I was taking notes, and the notes slowly turned into a poem. And I figured, since it's important to hear as many voices as possible speak up about this topic in whatever way they can, and they are best able to do so, because I find that so important. I shouldn't be a hypocrite and should also do it myself. So more than making this moment about me, let's all make this moment about yourselves. And I hope all of you will be inspired to speak truth in your way, whatever way that is, because we need everyone. The poem is called Monuments. I'm sure the day will come that we simply cannot fathom how on earth we silently allowed for this to happen. I'm sure the day will come that we will see the light, and in some stone-cold monument will engrave their names with pride. I'm sure the day will come that these terrorists we see will be the freedom fighters that we want our kids to be. For Malcolm X was killed before our hearts could see that he wasn't sowing hate, he was fighting to be free. And Mandela was a terrorist before we could believe that the truth may be different from what they want us to perceive. I'm sure the day will come, but I pray it comes today. That we finally learn our lesson before our chance passes away. To contribute to the good and to not let justice fall. So when tomorrow comes, we don't need monuments at all. Thank you.
I just wanted to make a couple of quick points. That I think are very important to the conversation. Okay, so it's clear from what Jenna has presented and clear from one of the sources that I have is a source called Encyclopedia Palestinica. And in this Encyclopedia Palestinica, which is about 8 volumes, the author painstakingly documented all the villages, major monuments, mosques, significant other buildings. For instance, the building that used to, the original building for the Palestine Symphony that became the Israeli Symphony, because believe it or not, a lot of Jews that came from Europe in World War II, a lot of Jewish musicians, they joined the Palestine Symphony, and there was a Palestine Symphony, and it was quite significant before it was turned into the Israeli Symphony, and the Palestinians on the symphony were kicked out. So in this major source, painstaking documentation of all these sites of Palestinian erasure, where Palestinians were, and they were erased systematically. And what you clearly see is that this erasure didn't stop after Camp David, it didn't stop after Oslo, it didn't stop after any of the peace agreements, and it continues to our very day. Now, one very clear point, when a people is confronted with an apartheid system, a system of systematic discrimination and erasure, is, well, can't they resist peacefully? And this is one of the biggest challenges, because let's be very clear. The first Intifada and the second Intifada was about peaceful resistance, unarmed resistance. Throwing stones under international law doesn't qualify as armed resistance. Kids throwing stones. What happened to the first Intifada? What happened to the second Intifada? What happened to all the marches of protests that Palestinians have organized in Gaza and in the West Bank again and again? But the role of the international community is very complicit in acts of violence and terrorism that take place. Why so? Because if the international community would have communicated to Palestinians that, as they did, for instance, with apartheid in South Africa, that your acts of nonviolent resistance has support, has recognition, and can produce results, we could be confronting a very different situation today. One of the most prominent acts of nonviolent resistance in the case of apartheid in South Africa and also in the case of apartheid in Israel is the divestment and boycott system, the BDS. What happened to the boycott and divestment movement in the world? The international community, how did they react to and receive and deal with the peaceful system of boycott and divestment that produced results in South Africa and that did not produce results in Israel? What happened is that everyone related to the boycott and divestment system in the West was labeled an anti-Semite. The movement did not bear fruit because the major governments of the world that are liberal democracies, that are the guardians of human rights, that are the advocates of human rights around the world, looked at this movement and said, we're not supporting you, you're illegitimate, you're all anti-Semites. So what do you do when you have General Assembly resolutions that say Palestinians have a right to resist occupation even if it is armed resistance? Every assembly, every attempt to pass a resolution in the Security Council from the 50s till today was vetoed by the United States. Every single resolution. Every single resolution in the Security Council trying to hold Israel accountable for its abuses has been vetoed by the United States. That means complicity. That means that whether we want to realize or not, we are complicit in any insane act of violence that occurs on the ground, because we've shut out all other avenues and all other venues, and we've communicated to Palestinians, we expect you to just die in silence, to be erased in silence. Tell me, how many people do you know are willing to be erased in silence? Now, as to what is happening in Gaza, let's just be very clear about this, because this is very important. The Genocide Convention. Genocide is a crime against humanity, meaning that a state does not even need to sign the Genocide Convention to be bound by the prohibition against genocide. Genocide is designated as a jus cogens, or in international law, meaning that the violation of the Genocide Convention is a violation of a preemptory norm of international law, and it is one of the few violations that is supposed to be above and beyond politics. There is no way you can derogate from the prohibition against genocide, meaning there's no way that you can take exception to there is no set of, let me be very clear about this, in international law, there are no circumstances that would make genocide legal. No circumstances. It's a prohibition, the same prohibition against slavery. Under no circumstances can slavery be legal. The prohibition against torture. Under no circumstances can torture be legal. I mean, we, of course, unfortunately violated that in the wake of 9/11. And same thing with genocide. There are no circumstances under which genocide can be legal, regardless of the excuse. Now, look, the prohibition against genocide has 5 elements. So I'm going to tell you these elements. Killing of members of a group, targeting a group, killing of its members, causing serious bodily or mental harm to the members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group, and finally, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. You don't have to fulfill all 5 elements for genocide to exist. If you fulfill some of these elements, genocide exists. You're committing a genocide. Now, Israel has been systematically killing Palestinians and is currently systematically killing Gazans as a group. They have been systematically causing serious bodily or mental harm to Palestinians and right now to Gazans as a group. They have been deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction in whole or in part. When Israel allows, before this conflict began, 70% of the water in Gaza is not fit for human consumption. 70% of the water in Gaza causes miscarriages and causes birth defects. And this is before the conflict started. Currently, right now, no water, no electricity, no food. That's deliberately inflicting conditions calculated to bring about the destruction of the group, either in part or in whole. Imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group, even that, arguably, Israel is guilty of because of the consistent problem of, one, in Gaza, of malnutrition, because Israel calculates the amount of calories that it will allow to enter Gaza. But even outside of Gaza, as you heard Jana talk about, the manipulation of environmental conditions to cause miscarriages is a genocidal crime. And forcibly transferring. Now, what do you think is going to happen when you are consistently reducing a population from 150,000 to, what was it?
120,000 to 3,000.
From 120,000 to 3,000. Where do you think these children go? They move to Gaza, as a lot of the people in Gaza have actually moved from historical Palestine to Gaza. And then you tell them, now you have to move from south to north? North to south. And then as they are moving, you bomb them and you murder them. There's a caravan, 70 people were killed as they were attempting to make the move. And using the corridor that Israel told them is going to be safe.
And of course, that's not a report. We saw the footage.
We saw the footage. It's not something reported. Okay? And Israel, and this is really a critical point, and I made this point in the khutbah that I gave on Friday. Normally, Israel comes and says, well, there are crimes committed against us. Okay, the way to handle a claim of crimes is to invite investigators from the UN to come and to investigate Israeli claims and Palestinian claims, and to give them full cooperation and access. Israel has refused. Every single time the UN has tried to launch an investigation, even when Palestinians said yes, and typically Palestinians say yes, by the way, and typically Palestinians are the ones who ask for the investigation, Israel blocks it and says, we're not going to cooperate. And if people proceed like James Dugard did, like Richard Falk did, like that Gladstone report did, and they investigate anyway, Israel calls them anti-Semites because they don't like the conclusions that these investigators reach. Palestine Authority signed the the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. Israel said, no way. And the US used its power to block off any investigation by the International Criminal Court. So, where to turn? What to do? You have a systematic genocide taking place against the Palestinian people, and now an even aggravated genocide taking place in Gaza. And the world watches, and the West, which is absolutely complicit in this genocide, sitting by and saying,
Don't call for de-escalation.
yeah, it's terrible, but, Israel should just, try to be more humane. That's effectively what's going on. That's it. So, I mean, Wietke's poem, in a very beautiful way, I mean, hits it on the nail. It makes witnessing this historical moment beyond the endurance of immoral human being. That's all I want to say. Anything you want to say before we go Q&A?
No, but maybe just to add, I mean, we also start the count of the clock at 1948, and it begins far before that. I mean, it would be good to. We were going to compile some resources for people to review some of websites and places that you can get educated. But I mean, this even stems back to the early or late 20s, the Burak Revolution, Palestinian revolution, and uprising against the occupation in the British Mandate, and the initial 3 martyrs in Akka, as we were talking about Akka. This goes back to, that was in 1929. Those areas, those early kibbutzes, where Jews lived amongst Palestinians, or were moving to live amongst Palestinians, and Palestinians kept them safe from British occupation forces, only for them to pick up arms in their militias and slaughter the entire village. We're not talking about genocide now in 2023. We're talking about systematic genocide for the greater part of an entire century. Do not rid the current unfolding events from the context of a century, and think of all of the steps that have been taken since that time to try to find a way, finagle a way, to come to terms with those circumstances back in the late 20s until now, 1920s. We're in 2023.
I mean, Jenna showed me that message you showed me by that doctor.
Mm.
I mean, can you share that?
Yeah, because it works for a university. I'll pull his name. It's on my phone. Someone said they're engaging in an ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and his response was, "It is a cleansing, but it's a much needed one, and these people aren't. It's not an ethnic cleansing of people. These people aren't human, or these aren't humans."
Yeah. Does he get into trouble for that? Does he get banned from Twitter for that?
I think that the centralized issue with Palestine and then globally, the global South in general, is that there has been an insistence on dehumanizing people who it's an insistence on dehumanization. If you can convince a people that certain people don't feel pain, right, or certain people are used to death, or certain people their lives have always been in turmoil, and this is nothing new to the region, like that type of rhetoric adds to the dehumanization of what we're currently seeing, and it's a symptom of an obsession with proximity to whiteness. And there's a clear delineation when these things are happening. Like even myself, when we were talking, I accidentally said 55 Palestinians died. I didn't even use the affirmative of have been killed. We have to consider the way that we're consuming information and then how we're disseminating that information back when we're saying it, because it's so often that we were doing the math the other day. 1 million people died in Iraq. Almost 1 million died in Afghanistan.
These are the
Like,
lower
these are
estimates.
the lower
Of course, we don't know the
estimates,
reality.
But I saw the statistic today, and it said that during a year, Afghanistan had they had dropped like 6,000 bombs on Afghanistan in a year, and then that same amount had been dropped on Gaza in 8 days.
Yeah.
And we are so numb to our own pain and our own dehumanization that when 2 people die in the United States as a result of something. Like I don't even know what the actual metric is for calling something a mass shooting in the United States.
Yeah.
It's like
No,
2 to 3 people makes it a
is
mass shooting in the United States. And I know distinctly the names and the faces of most of the casualties that we have in the United States, like in horrific, tragic circumstances. I know these people's faces, I know their stories, but 1 million people can die in Iraq, and we can say that without grasping how many 1 million is. And it's because we have been convinced in this consistent long-term war on terror, and probably before that we are expected to die. And so when we die, it doesn't make headlines, or when we die, it doesn't mean as much, and it takes decolonizing your own brain to a certain degree to remind yourself and to remember. That's part of the reason, when I was sharing the photos, that when I was trying to put together photos of what to show, when people ask about Palestine, right? Like when you ask people what to show about Palestine, it's hard sometimes in the metric to know where to start with people. But I think sometimes the start needs to be proving not just I have a right to defend myself, but I have to prove that we are a people. Like there is something to be found here. There's a culture here. There's a people here. There's a shared language here. There's a history here, that it existed before the conflict in 1948, and God willing will exist far after 2023. But it's a reminder to those who are grappling with these types of issues, and they're big. They're really, really big. But it's a reminder when you're grappling with these type of issues to remind yourself that, the reaction that you have to pain that doesn't concern your countries, or the reaction that you have, the shock and awe that we have, it's something that we've been conditioned to be accepting of in our own communities. When we're told to condemn, it's because people believe that you are inherently violent. They believe you to be inherently violent. Cheyenne said something the other day about, everyone's asking me to condemn. Well, I pay US dollars. My condemnation is here. This is where my condemnation needs to be. My condemnation needs to be to the system that allows these types of things to perpetuate. My condemnation isn't even helpful anywhere else. because we've all been through the post 9/11 apologetics of the Muslim community. We've all been there already. We knew what it felt like to consistently be in a space where we were saying, not in my name, doesn't speak for me. Why are you telling me that I'm a problem, or I'm a terrorist, or I'm not inherently violent? And it's the same exact conversation now. People look at you, whether you're Palestinian, Arab adjacent, brown adjacent, it doesn't really matter. They don't make the distinctions. We know that there's separations in culture. We know that there's separations in identity. But people who are hell bent on making you believe that you are lesser than don't see a distinction between all of you. So when people say, fight for Palestine, it's not just for Palestinians. Yeah. It's because Palestine is a case study in what it looks like to dehumanize a people so effectively, to the point that when they're being cut off from the world and their resources are being squeezed out, and that they have no access to the bare necessity, the basic things that we all know are absolutely necessary, that there are enough people who can say, the news is stressing me out, I need to turn it off. Palestine is the clearest example of what it looks like to effectively dehumanize a population.
I mean, I saw this is on there are many channels: الحدث, الغد, الميادين, العربي, and some of the most incredible. You see these Palestinian children. Their bodies are violated in so many ways by the Israeli explosions. They're screaming in agony, and then the doctor says, we've ran out of painkillers. So this child is suffering the burns, the whatever these bombs do, screaming in agony, with not even the reprieve of morphine or and I'm supposed to look at this and say, oh, condemn Hamas. That's really the pertinent issue. I mean, where else is just like, you have to dehumanize people so much that you even look at the suffering of the children and say, well, it's the fault of their people. It's not the fault of the person who injured them. It's the fault of their people, and that's what's pertinent.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the problem too. It's such a good point, because we don't, even as a people, sometimes don't know where to place the blame. As a people, we're confused at this point. The situations. I understand geopolitics are complicated. I understand that it's complicated. But to me, a little bit of due diligence always clearly identifies who the largest perpetrator is. And you don't need to understand the internal dynamics of every single regional conflict to know that, right? So we know that Afghanistan was bloody. We know that Iraq was bloody. We know that Syria was bloody. We know that all of these places, we know that Libya was bloody. We know Sudan was bloody. We know Egypt was bloody. We know all the tales of the Arab Spring. We know everything everything's documented. But despite having this plethora of information, we're still not able to point the finger at the root cause of the problem, and we're concerned with this level of infighting instead of just identifying the problem of Western supremacy in these spaces that are using our leadership, supposedly. I mean, they're not my leadership, but whatever, using leadership in these regional spaces in order to operate on cold wars and create regional structures that push for sorts of influence that leave the population in dire circumstances. That's we know where the actual problem's in, and you don't have to have a degree in political science to figure it out. And so, I mean, I guess before we go to, I don't know what else, I don't have anything else to say, but the only way that you can effectively get some clarity, in my opinion, on what's happening in Palestine and otherwise is to take the time to educate yourself on what are the circumstances that have led to the current situation that we are in. So much of our analysis that we do is, is relegated to the short term, to the thing that is easily digestible. That's what today was supposed to show you, that it's never as simple as the narratives that were fed early on. And it starts with decolonizing your language too. It starts by calling it killing and not dead. It starts by affirmatively pointing to the root of the problem. And to do that is not to dive. Again, I think so many people get lost in thinking that that's dodging like dodging accountability. You're dodging what it is. No, you're pointing to the root causes of oppression. You're pointing to the root causes of injustice. You're pointing to root causes, and that makes the analysis more intellectually honest.
QA.
Yeah. Okay, so the first question is, thank you for sharing those photos. They speak to the importance of witnessing shuhud and memory that in the face of erasure, and the importance of Muslims investing in Palestinian artists and memory keepers as a form of resistance. Can you speak to documentation, memory, art, and other forms of intergenerational psychological resistance? Are there artists whose work that we can support?
Are there any other that are similar in genre?
Like currently?
Should answer that.
I mean, there are clear ones that are kind of somewhat obvious, like what's that?
I don't know. Sorry, go ahead.
Debke is a very clear one. I mean, that Palestinian folk dance is, obviously within the Levant region there is Syrian and Lebanese Debke, but Debke is a clear resistance art that has been kept alive, and kids today are still learning and making troops, and in the West. That's a clear one. But there are a number of Palestinian artists who do all kinds of beautiful art. Palestinian filmmakers, Five Broken Cameras. I believe it even won an Oscar, or at least was nominated. There are a lot of Ghassan. Who's the Kanafani, I think is his name. It is another great example of someone who was politically active, actively resistant, and who wrote a significant amount of literature and poetry.
I mean, he's certainly not alive anymore, but I think the best person that I've seen give a proper, not a proper, but Mahmoud Darwish's poetry is one of my favorite things to revisit, because it speaks to the Palestinian experience as a human, and then he also was very used his poetry as a way to document the surroundings, like his surroundings as they were changing.
Also add Simon Shaheen. Simon Shaheen is a brilliant violinist and oud master, and he studied music obviously in Palestine, and then came to New York and studied in the conservatory there, and he has recorded several albums of classical Arabic music and folk music, and he tours. So in every genre there is, and again, maybe we can try to compile some of these things and share them somewhere. But if you look, you'll find it quite accessible.
I would put it in a word for efforts like the Encyclopedia Palestinica. It's a tongue twister, but I know that it was very expensive to compile, and only 500 copies of it was published, because the publisher said that, considering the price of the encyclopedia, interesting. I mean, the publisher fully knew that they couldn't rely on Muslims to buy a lot of copies. So they said, well, we're mostly gonna just some Western universities are going to buy copies and that's it. So they literally printed just 500 copies. And I've always thought, these efforts to document, to keep the historical memory alive are so valuable. And if Muslims were not a colonized people, they would have. I mean, that encyclopedia was published without any fanfare among Muslims. Very few Muslims even heard about it. No talks, no major anything. I mean, can you imagine if something like that was published uh, in another culture to preserve the memory of another people? I think these are. I completely agree with the person who asked this question. It's so important. The art and maintaining and preserving the voice, but with just a modest amount of effort, it's easy to find out all the Palestinian artists that have been active, and also, you'll never find them in the mainstream. You'll never find them, um, center stage.
Next question. How, what is the best way to respond to other Muslims who are mainly concerned with making sure we denounce Hamas's actions so we don't look like we're justifying them?
Who wants to take a stab at it?
You should.
I think that Muslims who tell you that your first route is condemnation are Muslims who have fundamentally misunderstood their obligation to those who are in front of us actively being slaughtered. I don't have a good response to that because my issue is that okay, I guess I can start by I reached out to a lot of organizations when the events of this week unfolded, and I was told by a lot of people that we needed to condemn, and we needed to condemn first, and we couldn't hold even dua circles, or we couldn't do this, or we couldn't talk about Palestine, or we couldn't do any of these types of things because it was too political. And I think a lot of that is a remnant of the post 9/11 world that we're currently living in. If you're talking to American Muslims, I'm not entirely sure where the question is coming from, but I know in particular with American Muslims, there's a fear that we are going to be associated with actions that we may not agree with or whatever the case is. And to those people, my response is that I, as a Muslim, condemn the loss of innocent life always. That's the baseline. I don't need to explain that, and I don't need to say that. And to move the conversation to the actions of this particular party, or to move the conversation as though anything that they have done, similar to what the Sheikh said, and there's no justification for a genocide. There's no justification for a genocide. So it doesn't really necessarily matter. I think that a lot of that is posturing. A lot of it is posturing, and that is a cowardly way out to, instead of just saying, I am afraid of possibly being aligned with something, and instead of standing on truth that no population should be subject to collective punishment in the way that the Israeli occupying force has subjected Palestinians to that type of behavior, instead of saying that, you're concerned with condemnation. And to those people, I don't know if that's enough of a response, but that's my response.
Yeah, I think we've wasted a lot of time on this question. We don't have time. The khutbah from Friday addressed it far beyond what it even deserved. And the reason it had to do it that much is because we are detained by this point for far too long. It's spilt milk. We cannot go back in time. We cannot, there's no way to rewind this. It happened. So, but
over 750 Palestinian children are currently dead. That's my response. 750 Palestinian children have been murdered in the span of 8 days.
Answer the question. What should be done about them? What should be done about the next 750? You're detained by a non-immaterial fact, an immaterial reality. It doesn't matter. They were doing this before there was the attack on October 7th. They were doing this already. So this is immaterial. This is a Zionist smokescreen, a wrench in the wheel that's being thrown to stop us from they got caught off guard and surprised, and they turned the table on our side so that we cannot effectively organize to have a response that can do something that will stop this cycle or have any response whatsoever. We're just too busy fighting ourselves again. It's time to put it aside and unify and say, okay, you know what? You want to have this ridiculous issue that's detaining you. What are we going to do right now about these kids?
Or separately from that, ask the question, okay, I condemn Hamas. Do you then still support Palestinian right to liberation?
Go ahead.
No, that's it. That's my question. Because people who have a problem, the problem is that type of question is meant to trap you. That type of question is asked in order for, if you do condemn, then you're also inherently saying that no form of Palestinian resistance or liberation or whatever is justified if it's an aggressive force in any sort of way. And then if you say that you don't condemn, you're also a Hamas sympathizer. It's meant to trap you. It's meant to trap you. And I don't like feeling trapped by my fellow Muslims. When I'm supposed to have ethical and moral clarity, and you're supposed to have ethical and moral clarity so we can work together to stop the killing of 2.2 million Gazans, why are we talking about condemnation of a group that none of us have any influence with?
Yeah, I just want to add, look at the racist implications. I mean, a landlord in Chicago, attacked a woman and her child. He murdered the child. I believe the woman is injured and still alive. Now, can you imagine if every Jew that you meet, you'd say, do you condemn the attack that happened in Chicago? And they'll look at you and say, just because I'm Jewish, you're an anti-Semite. Or any Jewish organization that contacts me and wants to work with me, do I say, first, do you condemn the attack that happened in Chicago? No, the assumption is that I have towards any Jew or any Jewish organization that of course they condemn, because it's a criminal act and I don't assume them to be criminals or criminal sympathizers. But that's exactly what it means to always stand accused. That why should it even be an issue that I might in any way have anything to do with Hamas just because I'm a Muslim, just because I'm an Arab, just because I believe Palestinians have rights, just because I believe that a genocide against the Palestinian people is wrong? So it's insulting. And it's the other thing I want to say is that in the khutbah on Friday, I said the following. One, I don't trust, this is very important, I don't trust the source. I am told about massacres committed against Israelis by a government that did not at all hide its racism, its supremacist ideology, that from the first day it came to power, it said Palestinians are animals and they should be exterminated. So when that government tells me babies were murdered, women were raped, I say, listen, I don't trust you. You're a racist. You're a fascist government. If you want me to sign on to the facts, we bring Human Rights Watch, we bring Amnesty, we bring the International Criminal Court to establish the facts on the ground. Now, the practice has been, because I've done this with Human Rights Watch, when we had investigators, we had on the board of directors Jews who commissioned the investigation, Jews who were part, in fact, the majority of the investigative team. And when we established the facts and Israel didn't like the facts, it simply dismissed Human Rights Watch and said, oh, your guys are a bunch of anti-Semites. So I am sorry, when that source that has showed a consistent pattern of being supremacist, of being unfair, unequitable, I have every reason to say, I don't believe you. It's not that I'm calling you a liar. I am just simply saying I don't know what the facts are until the facts are impartially established. That's one. That two is the point that I was making about why should it be? I mean, why should it be assumed that I have any sympathy or relation or even any ideological harmony
Yeah.
with Hamas? But third, in the khutbah, I said, if Hamas, in fact, is responsible for sexual assaults, if Hamas is responsible for murder, and I asked and I prayed to Allah to curse them, la'anahumullah. Now, one would say, well, what's the difference? Oh, there is a big difference. When I pray to Allah to curse someone who violated the rules of ethics and morality and Sharia, I am using my language, my identity, to assert my moral boundaries. But when I say condemn, as Jenna, same idea, is that when I say condemn, immediately that translates into I'm supporting Israel. And what they're saying when tell you condemn Hamas is effectively saying support. We've got to know that you support Israel. There is no way that you can use the language of the colonizer without surrendering to the colonizer. So I will use my language. I am very comfortable saying la'anahumullah, much stronger than condemn, much stronger. May Allah curse them. But I will not use your language because I don't submit to your supremacy. That's the difference.
Given that you are all lawyers, we all know that there are legal definitions for apartheid, but is there anything in international law regarding settler colonialism itself?
We have the
Expert.
expert, yeah.
There is plenty. I mean, there is, from even the very first salvo of human rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Universal Declaration of Human Rights condemns colonialism. And let's be very clear, with the colonialism that that was always It's not, there's a difference. Foreign occupation is when you occupied, like the US occupied Iraq. There are plenty of condemnation of foreign occupation. Colonialism means the institution of colonialism. And colonialism legally was always the replacement of an indigenous population. The dominance, supremacy, and the replacement of indigenous population. So, tons of human rights instruments, and we say human rights instruments means human rights resolutions, human rights treaties, a whole encyclopedia of them condemning colonialism, i.e. settler colonialism, tons of resolutions and treaties on the rights of indigenous people to protect and maintain their own culture against foreign domination and foreign erasure. Tons of resolutions and treaties about cultural rights of a people. What Palestinians lost is not just their land, but their cultural rights. The Debka was co-opted by Israelis. Israelis dance the Debka and say, that's mine, that's ours. The Israelis co-opted Palestinian food and said, that's ours. Israelis co-opted Palestinian everything and said, that's ours. So that's a violation of indigenous rights, a violation of cultural rights, a violation of human rights. So if you are, the only reason anyone can be confused about this is that in international law, the way it's taught in American universities, there is a clear bias towards human rights that the West cared the most about, so-called civil and political rights, a due process, freedom of speech, equal protection of the law, and a clear bias against indigenous and cultural and economic and the human rights of the colonized. Why? Because the US has a very guilty conscience about what it did to Native Americans. I mean, it's just as simple as that. So when we teach international law in American law schools, we actually, when I say we, unfortunately, it's the way textbooks are written, American legal textbooks are written, is that we emphasize civil and political rights, and we deal with economic and cultural and indigenous rights as sort of secondary. Well, that's simply wrong. Simply absolutely wrong. Because indigenous people don't just disappear. Look at what we did to the culture and the identity of Native Americans. We've decimated the heck out of it. And if the United States owns up to the reparations they owe Native Americans for the absolute destruction, annihilation of their culture, or the reparations they owe Black people for the annihilation of their culture. I mean, instead of giving billions of dollars to Israel to perpetuate its genocidal program, how about redirecting these billions of dollars to Black people and to Native Americans? No, the US says we don't recognize they have rights to reparations. We gave reparations to the Japanese that we interned in Kuromatsu, but because they're closer to white people. And you know also why, which is a reality, is because most Japanese converted to Christianity. So they became closer to whiteness. Because Japan itself relinquished much of its cultural identity and performed whiteness, and we're happy with that. We're sort of like, oh, good people. They're the good people. South Korea also good people. But when it comes to people that try to hold on to anything indigenous and authentic, we're brutal. Say, we owe you nothing. So absolutely, there's plenty in international law that is directly against settler colonialism and erasure of culture and erasure of indigeneity itself.
Great answer.
When speaking about freeing Palestine, a lot of people look to the history of Algeria's occupation by the French for hope. What similarities and differences do you find between the occupations? And do you think the timeline of liberation will be similar to Algeria's, or do you predict it to be longer or shorter, and why?
So that was a multi-part question. One was, do I see similarities? I think the answer is yes. I was actually just talking the other day about how unfortunately it took 1 million Algerians to liberate Algeria. And there's actually a really interesting intersection of Algerian Black movements and Palestinians in particular. There's a really interesting cross section historically, and I think if you look to that movement, it's very interesting because while we're concerned and debating about whether or not being an allyship is a smart strategic move, our forefathers, the people who made organizing what it was, knew very clearly that our struggles were intrinsically tied to one another. I don't know about the timeline at all. I think that's part of the reason a lot of this is scary, and I don't want to be the only person to comment on this. But I don't know about the timeline. And whenever you speak to Palestinians about being disparaging or being sad or falling in despair, the older population always reminds me that it's only been 75 years. And they say that with the usage of the word only, and then they always remind me of Algeria. So I don't know if that's an answer necessarily, but what I do know is that we're living in a very, very, very interesting time, and a time that I didn't think that I would see our country not step in on a matter as large as a genocide. I didn't think that that was a reality. And I think that's why it's kind of adjusted the timetable a little bit in my mind, because the question that you're asking is one that I've been grappling with. And it's the idea that, if this changes tomorrow and then the ground offensive happens and then all of these things are so intrinsically tied to regional politics at this point, and who gets involved and who doesn't get involved and how long we allow people to not get involved. And if a ceasefire does happen and if a ceasefire doesn't happen, and then is the ethnic cleansing just delayed and not, continued on to go unchecked on course? Like, there's so many different things at play.
I'm sorry. I'm just like, I really don't understand. It's not just that we are standing by and allowing genocide to happen. We are complicit in this genocide.
Exactly right.
We are complicit because we've given, not just given the fascist government of Netanyahu the green light. We've given them the phosphorus bombs that they're using. We've given them the bombs that weigh a ton. We've given them the arsenal to bomb Gaza in 6 days, to throw on Gaza in 6 days what we threw on Afghanistan in a year. We, the US. Now, this is criminal complicity. Yeah. But even I mean, and mind you, Gaza is populated far more than Afghanistan and even more than Iraq. I mean, you are talking about nowhere to run, nowhere to go. If people, the reason the people just die in their homes because go where? I mean, they escaped from, so many people just left their home and went to stay with a neighbor and then got killed with the neighbor. So that's one thing. The other thing that I just really blows my mind is the arrogance and stupidity of power. So we are complicit in this genocide. We and of course the Egyptians, because the Egyptians are full participants in keeping this blockade for going on for 20 years. There is, if there was fairness and justice, those who are complicit would be held criminally liable. People like Bush, who killed 1 million Iraqis and 1 million Afghanis, would be held, and Cheney and so on would be held criminally liable. Anyway, but think of this. Israel expelled 750 Palestinians in 48 from their lands. Today, there is 6 to 8 million Palestinian refugees. So Israel this time is expelling 2.3 or 2.2 million Palestinians from Gaza. In 20 years, that population is going to be how much? And do you think that this population is just going to disappear? I mean, if you create refugees from Gaza and send them to Egypt, you've destabilizing Egypt for decades to come. If one day this produces a fanatical government in Egypt who will sit there and say, why are they so fanatic? Why are they so crazy? You've just created a greater, bloodier boundaries and borders. At what point does this colonizing ideology realize that this doesn't work? I mean, you've told Palestinians at one point were willing to accept a two-state solution. They were willing to take a little part of historical Palestine and call it even, right? Be done. And then you basically swallowed up, you told them you can have this plot of land, and then you divided this plot of land into little canteens separated by walls and so on, and you swallow up and annexed and settled and brought in settlers from all around the world and said, settle here, settle here, settle here. So nothing remains of what could have been two states. So what happened? Now Palestinians say, well, the Palestinian state is gone. We can't have a Palestinian state. So we must go back to thinking about entire Palestine, all of Palestine being liberated. You consistently push Palestinians into spaces and then sit there and puzzled why they're the way they are. It's insane. It's crazy. It's nuts. I mean, it is the very, I mean, why would, when you are consistently bringing in people to your country that you know are fanatic, are ideologues, they're religiously fanatic, so fanatic that you don't want them in Tel Aviv. There is actually now a real concern among secular Jews that fanatical religious Jews are settling in Tel Aviv, and they're worried that they're going to wake up someday and find that that fanatic religious Jews have done to Tel Aviv what they've done to Jerusalem, basically a takeover. So you yourself know that it is impossible to live with these religious fanatics. And because of that, so what do? You unleash them on Palestinians. That is why the area around Gaza is all full of these fanatic settlers who for years have been harassing and assaulting and attacking and doing everything they can to aggravate and antagonize Gazans. And then when these Gazans treat these settlers as a source of danger, we're sitting there, why is that? It's as if any idiot could have predicted that you are creating a disastrous situation. I mean, I don't know. And the thing is, there are so many Israeli intellectuals who have written repeatedly telling the consecutive unmoderate Israeli government that you're creating a disastrous situation. But no one listens. And especially the problem with the US, because the US gives cover for all of this. I'm telling you, Israeli government would not be so unreasonable and fanatical if they couldn't count on unfettered, unconditional American support, regardless of what they do.
Salam all, thank you for this deeply insightful conversation. This question isn't directly related, but I'm wondering if you could share your thoughts on it nonetheless. I organize with the SPHR on my campus, and we're trying to organize a Salat al-Fajr in Jama' after Maghrib. Some folks are saying that doing this in Jama' is bid'ah, and that if done, it needs to be after Isha, and are in general trying to stonewall it. Could you speak about Salat al-Fajr and normative protocols around it?
That's clearly not a question for me.
It's also a very disturbing question.
I really meant what I said in Friday khutbah. There are things that happen in the world that it's like, honestly, I'm not kidding you. It's like someone comes into my home and is raping my sister or my wife, and I sit there and I wonder if it's okay to, if the sunnah is to knock before I enter, or to say assalamu alaikum, or whether the other women in the house while this sexual assault is taking place are properly covered. There are things that happen that it uncovers a degree of obscenity in our psychology and in our hearts and in our souls. If we worry about a فرع من الفروع, something that is a remote marginality, Palestinians are being erased. A genocide is taking place. And I'm not talking about the person asking a question, I'm talking about the people who are telling you this is bid'ah. And your issue is whether Salat al-Haja is bid'ah at Maghrib or after Isha. I mean, I am absolutely 100% sure if the Prophet ﷺ was here today, he would pray Salat al-Haja after Fajr and after Dhuhr and after Asr and after Maghrib and after Isha. Anyone that understood the seerah of the Prophet would understand that he was not a robot. The man responded as a fully moral human being. So tell these people, tell them, I said that. You don't even have to tell them that it's from you. Tell them it's from me. Shame on you. Shame on you. You understood nothing about the sunnah of the Prophet. You understood nothing about the seerah of the Prophet. You are Sharia idiots. You understand nothing about the Sharia whatsoever, even the most basic elements of Sharia education. When your house is on fire, you don't sit there and worry whether you exit the house with your left foot or your right foot. You don't. So the stupidity has to stop. The obscenity has to stop. And if you want to understand fully what I'm talking about, listen to the khutbah I gave on Friday.
I would like to know what we can do if our employers are standing with Israel. To tell a bit of my background, I'm from India and I work in India for a Canadian enterprise. I thought it was a great job, as I will inshallah soon have the opportunity to move to Canada, escaping the toxic Islamophobia here in India. But right this week, the CEO announced that they stand in solidarity with Israel and are donating 500,000 Canadian dollars. So what should I do now? I feel very guilty working here I now feel guilty working here, though until last week I was thinking this job as the best thing happened to me in my career. Certainly Allah knows best.
Maybe I don't know, the Sheikh might disagree with me and set me straight, which would be very welcome. We are in a losing ditch at the moment. I don't think that the answer is a zealous response by quitting your job and remaining in Hindutva occupied India and being fully neutralized. We need every ethical voice here, and we can effectuate change here. And it's not just your company. JP Morgan Chase is doing it. Procter and Gamble is doing it. Dow Jones, this, that, the other. Everybody is doing it. So just one letter here or one, in terms of a pragmatic, logistic response, I don't think, and may Allah forgive me if I'm wrong, I don't think that what Allah wants from you is to quit your job in protest or maybe even write a letter. I think we have to do something far, far, far more ambitious. Far more ambitious. This needs to be a strong response. And there's something that I'm currently working on. I don't want to talk about the specifics right now because I don't want it to get derailed. But just stay tuned. It will be something that is much bigger and a bigger aspiration. It will have impacts on the financial strength in this country and in Canada if you want to be someone who works on this project, and it will have significant effect on the electoral politics in this country and in Canada and everywhere else. Because at the moment, we are on some sort of weird social contract that is unconscionable, to use legal terminology, that we've entered, in which we are allowed into this country on a merits-based system, and we are given the opportunity to work here, to produce, to jumpstart the economy, to buy things here, to jumpstart the economy, and to sell things here, all in service of the economy. And the moment that we open our mouths to say that we don't like something about what our government representatives are talking about, the best that they will do is they'll give you a teenage intern to listen to you and say, well, sorry, the senator's not available today, but go ahead. I mean, I've worked with CARE before, and I've done this. I know we take in these little kids and we're like, here's Capital Day, and it's a great option to try to get children involved in American civics and Western civics and say, look, we can do this and we can go and pray in the State House, and that's great. But this is at the bare minimum. When we go up there, they say, well, here is this 20-year-old intern that is working there for $10 an hour and says, sure, go ahead and I'll relay your concerns to the senator. I mean, this is, but meanwhile, you have people LeBron James is jumping to type something and say, oh my God, I hope my shoe sales don't go down. I stand with Israel. I mean, how could I don't even know if anyone emailed him. He just probably did it himself. That's the state that we're at. So if the scales are this imbalanced, I don't think I'm glad for the ethical compass turning on and saying, I feel like this is wrong. Maybe this is not. You need your currency and you need your purchasing power so that you can abstain. If you withdraw that currency, it will affect, and that's just one person. What if you have 100? What if you have 1,000? If you abstain from voting, what will happen? I'm all for us getting, talking to our representatives and saying, this is not something we're okay with. We are your constituents. You must follow what we say. But have they been doing that? We've been doing that. We've been doing that. And the reason it doesn't work is because our political currency in this country and in Canada is very, very low. It's nominal. But if the JCC or Hillel or whatever organization picks up the phone, if they hold a vigil in this Columbus, Ohio, at the Ohio State University, we had the mayor, we had the senator, who was the other one? Joyce Beatty is who? Congressional representative. All were at this vigil for a measly 100 children at Ohio State as far as students. Did anybody call a mosque to say, hey guys, even an intern from the senator's office, call the mosque to say, are you guys okay? Is there anything we can do as the representatives? You are our constituents. We are concerned about your safety. I know that there's probably the possibility of Islamophobic attacks on the rise. Is there anything that we can do? Should we be in coordination? Did anyone call the senator's office worried about that? So I appreciate the concern, and I appreciate, this feels wrong and I don't know and I'm conflicted. Then that means that you need to talk to your micro community or stay plugged in to this space and others, because we need to be far more ambitious than rallies. Rallies are a good place to start. We need to continue doing that. There is no place where we need to stop, but we also need to do something that's bigger. Think bigger.
I don't disagree with Sean, but on that same note, if you are facing legal consequences for showing support or doing anything along those lines, there are resources such as PAL Legal, and I would really encourage you to reach out because plenty of people are not just sending back letters like they're getting disciplined for posting and things like that. And that's not me saying don't post. That's not me saying that. That's me saying you have rights, and if you need support, there are legal groups that are working for that. So please be aware of that and contact PAL Legal if you need that. That's the only addition that I had to what Shan said.
Yeah, but he shouldn't quit his job.
Yeah.
Well, it's 9:30 and we weren't able to get through all the questions, but I think we have to call it for tonight. Thank you guys so much. This was unbelievable. The comments on both of the live streams. We're all very appreciative of this. So thank you for coming out and being with us.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jannah. Thank you, Cheyenne.
Thank you, Sheikh.
I mean, especially you guys now, twice in a row. I really appreciate that you're doing this and that you have hearts. See someone sending hearts. That's very special.
Thank you, guys.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. And inshallah, Grace will be back next halaqah, inshallah. And assalamu alaikum,
Assalamu
everyone.
alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much.